How's it going? I'm John from Japanese Knife Imports, and today we're here to do a Q&A session about knife sharpening and asymmetry and all kinds of various things. So I'm going to give a few minutes for people to get started and to log on. And in that time, I will try and talk about some random things. And then once you guys get started, if you join us in our Google Hangouts, you'll be able to actually submit questions through our question and answer app. And then we'll be able to answer them for you, which hopefully doesn't suck too much. And so, yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So, what should I get started on? Well, let's get started with some basics of knife sharpening while we're doing this kind of stuff to make this video useful for people in the future if they choose to watch this, what I imagine will be a relatively long discussion on knife sharpening. Hopefully we can make this useful for them as well. And we will get going from there. So I have some things here that are normally the sheets that I use when I talk about knife sharpening. And I hope that you will find them useful. And of course, if you guys have any questions, you can always bug me at johnjon@japaneseknifeimports.com or call us at the store. We're here Monday through Friday, except for Thursdays, from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from noon to 5, and our number is 310-399-0300. Anyways, so first I'm going to go over the basics of double bevel knife sharpening, and then we'll go over some single bevel stuff and kind of go from there. And we have videos that go over all of this stuff, so if you look on our website, you'll see we have a media and news center that has various links, and the first thing that you'll see is a knife sharpening playlist. It's a little over 3 hours of everything that you will ever need to know about knife sharpening. We just keep making videos. I don't even know why at this point. Realistically, it's in response to questions. A lot of people ask us questions, and so what we try and do is when enough people ask us a question, we make a video response to it, which then hopefully many people can get help from. So, double bevel knife sharpening. I hope that you'll be able to see these images, but just in case you can't, there are links to all of them through our blog, and also in the various videos that we have that actually have hyperlinks that go to them. So here's our first thing on double bevel knife sharpening, which I imagine that you can see. When we are doing double bevel knives, we're going to start from a knife that's relatively not sharp, whether it's rounded over or chipped or dull or whatever it is. And we're going to sharpen on one side of the blade until we form a burr. And there are a few reasons that we form a burr. The first reason is obviously it tells us that we're sharpening the edge of our knife, which in the whole scheme of sharpening is a relatively important aspect. But there are a couple other things that it tells us that are equally important. It also tells us that we're removing fatigued steel from the edge. And so all day as we use our knife, we're banging our knife against stuff, whether it's the cutting board or food or whatever it is. Our edge becomes fatigued, very similar to the way that a paperclip becomes fatigued as you bend it back and forth a bunch. I don't know, when you have free time. So we want to make sure that we're removing fatigued steel from the edge and that we're sharpening the edge. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the burr is consistent from heel to tip all the way through so that we can make sure that we're removing the same amount of metal at each place along the blade. For those of you that are joining us now, we have a question and answer app loaded up so you guys can actually submit questions and then I will do my best to answer them. And in the meantime, I'm just talking about the basics of double bevel knife sharpening so that hopefully it's useful for people out there. So what we've done here is we've started from a knife that's relatively dull. Let's let that focus really quick. And then we sharpen on one side of the blade until we form a burr that's even and consistent from heel to tip. And as I've just explained, it tells you exactly those things. It tells you that you're sharpening the edge, that you're removing fatigue steel, and that you're removing the same amount of metal at each place along the blade, assuming that it's even and consistent all the way through as you go. So once we finish that, we do the same thing on the other side of the knife. So you can see here. And so once we've sharpened one side and formed a burr and even consistent, we sharpen the other side and form a burr that's even and consistent. We go through a number of steps to make sure that we remove that burr and have a clean, sharp edge. And that's our goal. We want to make sure that we have an edge that is clean, doesn't have a burr, residual wire edge, or anything that we'll be able to cut effectively for a long period of time. I can't tell. I guess someone named Chris has joined us over here. Chris, what's up? I don't know if you have like a microphone that's working or not. And, oh, Emily Haberman. Hey, how's it going? What's up, Chris? Hey, so how is the video working, just out of curiosity, having not done this thing in a long time this way?
You're in your underwear.
No, just you're up.
That's awesome. So, I guess I have a new chat message over here. Chris Anderson, how's it going? Hey there, John. Sweet. What's up? Yes, got that much. So we have the question and answer app loaded up. I don't know if you guys had any questions, but I kind of wanted to talk about edge asymmetry, as I figured that people would ask me about that at some point. Chris, can you hear us now with your earphones in? Ideally. All right. So as I went through with this, talking about like the basics of sharpening stuff, I had someone earlier today on Kitchen Knife Forums ask about edge asymmetry with regard to this, and so they said, well, like pretty much you just sharpen on one side until you form a burr, and you flip it over and sharpen on the other side until like the burr is formed on the opposite side again, and then you remove it and you're good. And I said that in essence, yes, that's the case, but if you continue to do that over time, you're likely to spend a lot more time sharpening one side than the other side, and you're going to develop a more extreme asymmetry. And so as you sharpen your knife over time, what you want to do is pay attention to edge asymmetry. And I think that edge asymmetry has been like a very confusing subject to a lot of people for a very long time. Sorry, I'm just going to mute some things over here. So here's what it is that you need to know about edge asymmetry. There are a few basic concepts that you need to understand, and once you understand those concepts, you can make sense of what you need to do and sharpen in a more appropriate way. Most Japanese knives are not ground evenly on either side of the knife. So when I say the side of the knife, I mean, let me just grab one really quick. What I mean is that this side of the knife is not necessarily ground the same as this side of the knife. And because of that, when it cuts food, assuming that you haven't done anything to compensate for it, your knife is likely to steer in one direction or another direction. So therefore, the edges of the knives tend to be ground asymmetrically, which helps us compensate for this uneven grinding on the side of the knife. Here are the things that you need to understand about asymmetry to be able to make smart decisions about how you sharpen your knife. First and foremost is this. When you cut things, there are two parts of your knife that are going to make a difference in how your knife moves through food. First is the way that your edge is sharpened, the angle that you do it, how refined it is, so on and so forth. And the second is how thick or thin your knife is behind the edge. So those are things that you need to know. In addition, you're going to need to know that the thinner that you go with your edge, the more sharp it will feel, the more easily it will move through food, but the more fragile or brittle it's going to be. The thicker that you go with your edge, the more tough and durable it's going to be, but it's not going to move through food quite as easily. So keeping that in mind, it's also important to understand that assuming that you're maintaining the same angles, as you move more asymmetrically from one side to another, the area behind the edge will become thinner as you go more asymmetrically, and a little bit thicker as you move less asymmetrically. So now we know that as we move more asymmetrically, your knife is going to become thinner behind the edge, which is going to mean it's going to move through food more easily, but it's going to be a little bit more brittle. But also, it's going to start to steer a little bit more. And what happens is that there's going to be different amounts of pressure exerted on either side of the knife. So the way that pressure is dealt with is this. One is just surface area, and two is angle or degree of the bevel. The more pressure being exerted on one side versus the other is going to cause steering. Sometimes that steering is okay as it compensates for the unevenness that we have up in the upper section of the blade. But when the upper section of the blade isn't uneven and you start to have an edge that creates one side with more pressure and one side with less pressure, you're going to notice your knife steering. So when you notice your knife steering, this is what you need to do. You need to think about a few things. You need to think about, one, is my knife moving through food with the kind of ease that I expect it to move through food with? If so, great. If not, then you're going to need to make the knife thinner behind the edge or lower the overall angle in some way. Two, which direction is my knife steering? Does it steer, to the left, or does it steer to the right? If you notice that your knife is steering to the left, you need to create some kind of more surface area on the left side of the knife, which will then exert more pressure on the left side of the knife so that your knife cuts straight. If it steers to the right, you create a little bit more surface area on the right side of the knife so that your knife cuts straight. You always want to make sure that you do this in little increments instead of going overboard. But realistically, the only things that you need to know about asymmetry are some very basic sharpening concepts. And once you have those things down, you can make logical, coherent decisions about what you want to do with your blade. So you can deal with asymmetry in a wide variety of ways by either sharpening more on one side than the other, or changing angles, or doing some combination thereof. But what you want to do is pay attention to the way that your knife is cutting, how it's working for you. Use the basic concepts you have about sharpening, being the thinner you go, the more easily it will move through food, but the more fragile or brittle it's going to be. The thicker you go, the more tough and durable it's going to be, but the less easily it will move through food. And then, how much it's going to steer and how thin it will be behind the edge based on these kinds of asymmetries that you do, and how much surface area is on each side. And then you use all of those concepts together to decide, well, this is what I want to do. So, for example, if I notice on this blade, which I'm going to try and get zoomed in on really quick, we'll see how it works. Let's see if it works better this way. Okay, if I notice on this blade, my edge is larger on this side than it is on this side, which hopefully will zoom in a second. Let's see if we can get it to zoom over here. Maybe not. Hold on. I know that I can make this work. All right, so we can see that the bevel here is smaller than the bevel here. Focus again, please, camera. All right, that means that assuming that the sides of this knife are ground equally, this knife is likely to steer in this way, where the bevel is larger on this side and smaller on this side. In this case, the sides of the knives aren't ground equally, so it doesn't happen. But assuming that it does, and I have an issue with it steering this way, all that I need to do is create more surface area on this side of the knife so that it exerts more pressure in this direction and starts to cut straight. And I can do that either by sharpening more on this side of the knife, creating an asymmetry kind of like, for example, it starts out like this, creating an asymmetry more like this, or I can lower the angle on this side, which is going to create a wider bevel, or I can do some combination thereof until I get the kind of results that I'm looking to get as far as the way that I want the knife to cut. Hopefully these things all make sense. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and try and use either the chat feature or actual like question and answer little app thingy thing that we have going on here. And in the meantime, if you'll bear with me for a second, I'm going to check the YouTube comments and see if anyone has kind of missed what we've been doing over here. And sorry, I have customers trying to come in and we're already closed. Give me a couple of seconds to check this as well, and we'll see what's going on. So were there any questions so far? Nothing so far. What other concepts should I just continue to go over, like basic double bevel sharpening? Let's do that in a second. Let me check really quick here and again see what's going on. How do I get to my videos? All right. So as we start to go over in the beginning of this, we talked about double bevel knife sharpening. And that double bevel knife sharpening was this sheet that we went through here, where we have a dull blade. We sharpen on one side until we create a burr that's even and consistent from heel to tip. Sharpen on the other side until we create a burr that's even and consistent from heel to tip. And then we go ahead and clean up that edge until we have a nice, clean, sharp edge. I get a lot of comments about burrless sharpening and how sharpening works when you don't create a burr. And I actually had a really interesting discussion with another sharpener the other day on this, on YouTube, I think, of all places. It's an interesting thing, and I think a lot of people misunderstand what is burrless sharpening when they first get started. It's not that you're not creating some kind of burr. You must actually create a burr at some point through the burrless sharpening that you're doing. And usually what it is that people take the knife and they grind it against the stone, creating a flat part of the edge over here. And that initial step, A, creates a burr, but B, achieves the removal of the fatigue steel that we're normally looking for through the course of our formation of a burr and sharpening. And then what they're doing once they have, I can actually draw this out. Give me 1 second. And I will actually draw this out for you guys. I don't know if this is so visible here. I hope it is. So let's say this is your edge over here. What they're doing with the burless sharpening is the first thing that they're doing is grinding the edge flat, something like this. Now they have a flat spot along the edge, and they've removed whatever fatigue steel is over there. Probably it's not as drastic as my drawing is going to be. And then what they slowly do is they slowly work their way towards a sharper edge. So you can kind of see that I'm getting started a little bit over here, sharpening a little bit and a little bit. And they continue to do this until, one, when they look at the edge, they can't see that flat section anymore. And two, they notice a significant increase in sharpness all of a sudden, which will dictate that they have created a nice apex of the edge, as you can kind of see in this image over here. And so through this process, then, as long as they don't continue past that point of creating an apex, they have a nice sharp edge. There's nothing wrong with this kind of method of sharpening. I think, though, that the common misconception that this kind of sharpening doesn't create a burr at all is pretty ludicrous. We have some new chat messages. Sorry for the initial noise. No worries, Emily. I have kids also. Oh, this is your wife's account, so that means that you are Bill? Anyways, no worries. I have a kid too. Not a problem. And then that makes sense. It seems simpler. Exactly. It does seem simpler just to feel for a burr, which is why I teach people this way. It's not that one way is better or worse than another way, but what occurs is that through misunderstanding, people have a lot of problems. So the way of sharpening that I teach is a way where people can get feedback from what they're doing, whether it's tactile feedback or visual feedback or whatever it is, more so than what I see with other methods of sharpening. And so that's what I tend to recommend for people. Also, it's very tricky once you kind of like create that apex in the burless sharpening to not go over that point and then not create a burr. And so a lot of people inadvertently create small burrs, and it's probably not as difficult as a lot of people think it is to not create a burr. But I would rather people waste a tiny bit more steel in favor of being able to have some real results that they can then look at and be like, I did a good job, I didn't do a good job, this is why it worked, or this is why it didn't work. Which is really all I ever teach about sharpening is ways for people to think critically about what's going on in front of them. So you can take a look and you see, like, this is what happened, this is why it happened, and this is how it's going to work. And you can see those things and understand those things based on the knowledge that hopefully you have about sharpening. So hopefully this makes sense, and I will move on to the next subject that I want to go over, which is thinning behind the edge. I'm actually convinced that this looks like some kind of transformer symbol, but I think it makes sense. And so here we go. Blah, blah, blah. The burr also helps me in finding slight hollows in the blade road. Yeah, absolutely. Especially since you're making your own knives, you'll notice that on your grinder, I mean, no matter how good you are, you tend to have high and low spots. It's just a function of hand working things. Even machines have high and low spots, and it definitely helps you see those kinds of things when the blade is quite thin behind the edge, and when you don't have like a wide bevel to rely on as a visual cue. So yeah, the burr definitely will help you out with that, and you'll notice issues with the burr before you see waviness of the edge, for example. So I totally agree with that. All right, so thinness behind the edge. As I mentioned before, when you cut things, not only does the edge sharpness, like level of refinement and angle that you sharpen it makes sense, make a difference in the way it cuts, but so does all the area behind the edge. And so when we have a new knife, it kind of looks like this black line that hopefully you can see here, where it's relatively thin behind the edge. And as we sharpen over time, you'll see this first red V is slowly moving up the blade. You'll see that the knife becomes thicker behind the edge right here. And again, as we move even higher up, it becomes thicker and thicker. And so as the knife gets thicker behind the edge, it starts to move through food with more resistance. It's not cutting as well. And so over time, what we need to do is thin behind the edge. And thinning behind the edge is done by lowering the angle that you sharpen at in a relatively significant way. And you can see kind of the green lines here that demonstrate that. Hopefully this will focus shortly. Focus, there it is. That show the sharpening at a much more acute angle, and you can see how that affects the thickness behind the edge over here. You want to go slow with these things, But you also want to make sure that you understand what thin behind the edge means. And getting a lot of knives in for knife sharpening, I see a lot of people misunderstanding what thin behind the edge is. And so they'll come to me with a knife that's really like rather thick or rather chunky behind the edge, and they'll say, oh my God, my knife is so thin, but it's not working so well. Like I think the knife is broken or the heat treatment is wrong. And realistically, what it was is that they didn't spend enough time thinning behind the edge. I actually just had this conversation with my friend that's hanging out over here with me right now yesterday about a knife where he was thinning down a knife, and I showed him a brand new knife that was similar to what he had, and you could see differences in the edge geometry. And so what I mean by edge geometry, and I don't know how well this will focus, but we'll see, is this part over here. How thick or thin this part is over here. When you thin behind the edge, it shouldn't, sorry, blah, blah, blah. The camera shows it. That's awesome, Brian. Awesome comment. And yes, if I were at home, I'd be doing exactly the same thing. Totally get that. I like that, you know, people are making comments, and you're not the only one, by the way. A few people have made comments to me. Like, I'm so glad that my camera at home isn't working because I'm sitting here in my underwear, and how fucking embarrassing would that be? So, sorry for the cussing. But yes, you don't know, but you know, this might be all I'm wearing. No, I actually have clothes on. When you look at knives, you want to look at how this part looks. Obviously, if it's thin just right here at the very edge, but gets rather thick over here, when you cut, you know, very short items, you'll be fine. When you cut things that are a little bit taller, it's going to start to wedge in food again. And so you really need to pay attention not just to like 1 or 2 millimeters above the edge, but rather like 1/3 or halfway up the blade. Some people can even thin, you know, all the way up the blade, although it's very time consuming and doesn't look quite as good, and it takes a long time to refinish and is generally kind of a pain in the ass. But it is very possible to do. That's kind of what this whole image here addresses, which is the need to thin behind the edge. And I have another image here that I'm going to get to a little bit later. But if you look at this top part of it, you'll see the red line to the black line, which kind of represents what like a primary cutting edge might be. And the blue line to the red line here, not that this is like an end-all be-all of stuff, but the blue line to the red line here represents what the minimum of thinning behind the edge that makes sense to me would be. And this is like the bare minimum. If you do that, you'll probably still notice wedging in a lot of ways. You know, but it's better than what I see in a lot of cases. And I have Chris here saying he measures to verify behind the edge, 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters behind the edge as well. I sometimes sit here with calipers just out of curiosity, but I never take notes out of things. And realistically, what I've done, and I don't know how capable other people will be of this just because of what they have around them, but I have a lot of knives here that I know, like, this knife cuts well or that knife cuts well. And then I can go and compare. So, for example, like this is our Geshin Uraku. I'm going to grab another knife that's a little bit thinner, and I'm going to see if I can get the camera to zoom in a way where you can actually see that. So bear with me for a second here. I think I'm going to do it with slightly larger knives just because it might be easier for the camera to zoom in on. So here I have 2 knives. I have a Geshin Uraku 270 millimeter Wagyuto and a Geshin Ginga 270 millimeter Wagyuto. And I'm going to try and get the camera to focus, which means that I probably need to be out of the way here. Let's see if we can get it to... 1 second. I know that we can do this. So you can kind of see, I wish it was less bright here. Let's do it like this. You can kind of see the thickness differences here behind the edge, or at the spine rather. And if I hold these over the camera, as I'm about to ideally, over here, let's see if we can get this to focus. Sam, would you mind holding up like a piece of paper behind this so that it blocks out the background? A little bit lower. or I guess higher rather, sorry. Maybe I'm a little bit too close. All right, now you can kind of see the difference in thickness behind the edge of these two blades. Does that make sense? So you can see the one here is a lot thinner than the one on the other side of it. I don't know if this is so visible or not. Anyways, thank you, Sam. Really appreciate it. That means that this knife, which was the thinner of the two, is going to move through food much more easily than this knife, which was the thicker of the two. All right? So when you thin stuff, that thinness is not just like the very, very last little bit of the edge, but rather you want to pay attention to as much of the knife as you can so that you know when you cut food, as much of it as possible is going to be impacted as far as the geometry of the knife goes, cutting through food. So for me, one day I decided to measure and see what that angle that I was thinning at was, and it turns out that in a lot of cases, it's somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees, which is really, really shallow, really acute. And it also turns out that the more acute that you go, the more difficult it is to maintain a consistent angle as you go. And so I think a lot of people that are getting started sharpening are going to have a lot of difficulty maintaining that kind of angle. You'll see some scratching, up above where you're trying to thin, or you'll hit the edge in some cases. And then when you try and go to like finer grits to finish stuff up, it's not going to look as pretty. So you can always go through with sandpaper when you're done and clean it up, or if you have a nice belt grinder, like I know Chris, you have a nice belt grinder setup that you can then grab a Scotch-Brite belt and clean stuff up rather quickly, and it works out well, which is quite frankly what I do sometimes when I need to just get stuff done quickly. But so the thinner that you go behind the edge, the more up the blade that you go, the more effective your thinning is going to be. But you also have to keep in mind what kind of steel you have, what kind of heat treatment you have. The softer your steel is, the less capable it is of holding those acute angles, and the more likely it is to chip or roll over. The harder your steel is, the more brittle it's going to be as you go thinner, and so you're going to have to pay more attention and be a little bit more finesse-oriented as you go. Do these things all make sense? I hope so. Sweet. We don't have anyone using the question and answer thing at all. How odd is that? I'm going to go check in the YouTube comments again and see if we're missing any comments. And it looks like we're good. So everything here is in the chat so far. All right. So let's talk about a little bit more about thinning. So as you do, thank you, Brian. I appreciate that there. Someone is responding to what I'm doing. Oh, you just ordered your grinder last week, Chris? Dude, it's going to be like a life changer. I don't even use my grinder for making knives or anything like that. I use it just for refinishing stuff and like cleaning up wood handles. I have the most ridiculous setup for doing. It's literally like the most overkill that one could ever have. But man, it's like so much nicer than like the Harbor Freight thing that I was using before, and it not just in like power, but in tracking and consistency, so that you don't have like the belt flopping all over the place or moving from side to side as you're trying to be consistent on it. Which is ironic because when I'm on my big water wheel that I have out here, you can't flatten those things in traditional methods. So as they wear over time, you're always going to have some up and down play, and you're going to be like going on the stone like this, but you have to maintain a consistent angle. And so what we actually do is we grab an axe and we spin the wheel up and mark it with a pencil or a crayon, so we catch the high spots and miss the low spots. And when we see where the high spots are, we chop at it with an axe in a very specific pattern, so that as we continue to grind over time, those parts wear more quickly. Yeah, kind of similar to like an ice axe. But it's pretty funny to see like spin the wheel up, and then I'm sitting there in the room with an axe chopping at this wheel, and people are like, "What the heck is he doing back there to his machine?" And it's the way that you keep it flat over time. And if you see the big water wheels that kind of run around like this in Japan, they're maintained in that same kind of way. So back to thinning behind the edge again. The best thing that you can do for your knife is, instead of like waiting for a really long time and then thinning behind the edge all at once it's super thick, it's going to take you forever. The best thing that you can do is start to do it on a more regular basis. And so what I show here with my horrible drawing skills, and just keep in mind that none of this is to scale. It wouldn't look anything at all decent if I didn't use like a ruler. So I just tried to make it like look decent, aside from making things to scale. Usually when people sharpen their knives, they do something like this. Whether it's symmetrical or not symmetrical doesn't really matter. They sharpen on one side and the other side, make a nice clean edge, and move on with their lives, and it's nice. Realistically, what you want to be doing is something more like this, where you sharpen a little bit behind the edge each time that you sharpen, and a little bit at the edge each time that you sharpen, so that you maintain the kind of geometry that you're looking to maintain. And so the gist of it is this. You want to make sure that if, let's say this is your edge, including your thinning behind the edge, you want to make sure that the top of your thinning behind the edge, which is the top of my fingertips here, moves up at the same rate that your edge moves up. So say you have like a 1 millimeter chip in your edge, you need the top of your thinning bevel here to move up 1 millimeter, and then you move your edge up 1 millimeter, and everything stays the same all the way through. And this is how you maintain geometry. If you notice that your edge is moving faster than the top of your thinning bevel, or your regular bevel for that matter, your bevel is going to become thicker over time. If you notice that your thinning bevel is moving up faster than your edge is, your knife is going to become thinner over time. That's cool if that's what you're intending to do. It sucks if that's what you're not intending to do. And so, you gotta keep track of those things. But as long as you're paying attention to it, the best thing that you can do is do a little bit of thinning behind the edge, and then a little bit of sharpening each time that you go. And so that's how you'll keep your knife working in good shape. I actually just had a chef in here earlier. We were talking about his knife and why his boss was sitting here with me a little bit earlier. Why his boss's knife was moving through the fish more easily, and he didn't understand why his employee's knife wasn't cutting the same way. And so we took a look at the knives, and we saw that his knife was getting kind of thick behind the edge and needed to be thinned down a little bit, so it would be able to move through food in the same way that his boss's knife was. And so you'll see that this edge geometry is a really big part of how knives move through food. You'll notice on this little thing over here, if you look really closely here, you can see that from 3 to 4, I drew a little micro bevel in. And I did it only on one side because that's the kind of micro bevel that I tend to tell people about. And there are a few reasons that I do that. But the biggest reason is that when you have a micro bevel on both sides, it's a much higher inclusive angle. When you have a micro bevel on one side, it's a much lower inclusive angle than it would otherwise be. And so you're able to not lose that much in sharpness when you do the micro bevel the way that I explained here. And especially if you do it correctly. And so I guess yesterday, someone had asked me about microbevels, and I made a couple of posts explaining when and why microbevels make sense. I'm just going to go back to it right now so that I'm not losing my mind when I explain stuff to people. Give me 1 second here. So someone was using a microbevel on a Forstner and a Tojiro ITK knife in white number 2, neither of which are particularly thin and neither of which are particularly hard. And he was using a microbevel, and he had asked me for some notes on microbevels, which I was happy to share because I think that they're great tools. But when I asked him what kinds of knives he was using, I had to mention that I didn't think a microbevel made sense for them. And so here is when microbevels make sense. Microbevels make sense for maintaining extremely thin geometry on knives that would not otherwise be able to handle it. And the not otherwise be able to handle it can include the steel being extremely hard, where it's likely to be really brittle because of it, or extremely soft, where it doesn't have the structural strength or stability to be able to actually hold up that way. And so in those cases, you can use a microbevel to maintain that kind of thinness where you might not otherwise be able to. So hopefully that makes sense. The second reason is to reduce chipping in super hard steels, which is kind of dealt with in number 1 rather. But sometimes you have steels that are extremely hard. And whether it's because that was the intention of the knife maker, or you bought a knife that was beyond your skill level or ability to use, or whatever it is, you notice that you have chipping with those knives, you can use a microbevel to kind of mitigate that chipping and minimize that as a problem for yourself. So a good example of that for me would be the Geshin Heiji knives that we have here. It turns out that as a quenching agent, he only uses water because that's what he has around. And because of that, and because of the way that he chooses to go about things and the steel that he uses and so on and so forth, his steel tends to be on the hard side of things. And it doesn't matter if it's semi-stainless or it's carbon steel. He creates a heat treatment that gears towards grain refinement and hardness. And so you get awesome edge retention, and it has a really nice ease of sharpening because it's a really fine grain structure. But a lot of people who are okay with knives, like even our Geshin Ginga, have chipping issues with his knives. It's not to say that there's a problem with the knives, but it is to say that, you know, either you need the skill to be able to use that technically, or you need to adjust the sharpening in some way to be able to compensate for that. And so I recommend using a micro bevel with his knives, as it allows you to maintain the kind of edge geometry that you would have, and you lose the tiniest bit in maximum potential sharpness in favor of having a much more reasonable edge that actually holds up. The third one that I have here is increased stability in larger carbide steels, especially at low sharpening angles. Larger carbide steels tend to lose structural stability when you use really acute angles on them. And for whatever reason now, like I'm convinced that everyone thinks every steel is super fine grained. Like everything. People come to me like, this is a really fine grained steel, or that one's, and they're not. And I'm happy to like show them under the microscope, and we can polish things up and look at the carbide structure and see how it goes. But 19C27 is a perfect example of it, and I actually posted a link to Sandvik's website. 19C27 is a coarse carbide steel. It's designed for like cutting cardboard and industrial applications. That doesn't make it a bad knife for kitchen use. You just have to understand how best to work with it. So in the case, for example, of the Suishin Inox Sonyaki, it's an extremely thinly ground knife, and it's on the harder side of things. You can maintain that extremely thin geometry and relatively acute angles as long as you use the kind of appropriate micro bevel that will give it that kind of edge strength or structural stability that it needs. And so that's why Suishin specifically recommends these high-angle microbevels, which are the same kind that I teach in my YouTube videos, for that knife. It's because the carbide structure of the steel is on the slightly coarser side of things. And so to really get the best out of that steel in terms of edge retention and toughness and durability, you want to use a microbevel. And the microbevel on that is going to perform different from the microbevel on, I don't know, the Geshin Ginga. I just happen to have it out here, which is another kind of Swedish steel that's a much finer grained Swedish steel. The one that they're using here is designed to be extremely finely grained. It actually has less carbon also. But what happens on the extremely finely grained steels is that they don't require that same kind of structural stability addition that you would get from the microbevel. You can totally use a microbevel on the Geshin Ginga if you notice that it's too thin and you have chipping issues with it, or it's not holding up with the kind of edge retention that you need on, I don't know, the poly boards that you use at work or something like that. But it's not going to affect the edge in the same way on the Geshin Ginga as it does on the Suishin Inox Sonyaki. And so not every steel that people are using in knives are super finely grained. Some are, some aren't. And it's not necessarily that one is better than the other. You got to figure out what you like and what works well for you. For some people, some will always prefer yeah, exactly, AEBL. Sorry, I'm reading comments here as I respond to stuff, so if you guys aren't understanding what I'm saying, it's because I'm responding to a comment here in the chat. And AEBL is a perfect example of the opposite, and in fact, what's it called? 13C26, which is the equivalent of AEBL, is also made by Sandvik. When you look at Sandvik's website, you'll see 13C26, developed for use in straight razors. 19C27, developed for industrial cutting and cardboard. And just because they're like chemically very, very similar, in fact, really the only difference between them is the amount of carbon. A lot of people seem to think that 19C27 is going to be as finely grained as 13C26. But grain structure depends on so many different things, including heat treatment. But how much carbon there is relative to chromium, how they bond together, and whether they're forming chromium carbides or whether it's loose chromium, and how various things bond during the heating up and cooling down process, and then what the recommended heat treatment is. And so even things that are relatively close in chemical composition might be drastically different. You can also see things that are identical in chemical composition and have drastically different heat treatments and therefore have different grain size and structure. And again, it just really, really depends. Exactly. Total percentage of carbon as compared to the alloys. And these kinds of things affect how much carbon is bound with those alloying elements during the heat treatment process. And you'll see various carbides form because of it. And also you'll see it affect the grain structure. So what did we got through? We got through 3 of these things. So we got through microbevels used for maintaining extremely thin geometry in knives that would not otherwise be able to handle it, whether it's super hard or super soft or super thin or whatever it is. Reducing chipping in super hard steels, increasing stability in larger carbide steels, and improving edge retention at a cost of maximum sharpness. And I'm going to bring my little really bad drawing over here again so that you guys can see what that looks like one more time. So hopefully you can see here at the edge, the little micro bevel that we have changes the shape of the edge in a relatively significant way. The goal is to make this as small as possible and as even and consistent as possible. And the smaller that it is, the less that it affects the knife sharpening. But realistically, because of how small they are, the angles that we use don't matter quite as much. So a lot of people are really nervous about these high angle micro bevels that we do, where it's like 35 to 45 degrees, but you're removing so little of the actual edge that you still maintain that awesome edge geometry, but it gives it much more stability than, say, like having a 10-degree sharpening angle and a 15-degree micro bevel, which is really not a hugely significant change. If your micro bevel is on the larger side of things, you'll notice that that kind of micro bevel will make a lot more sense. But if you're doing a micro bevel in the way that I always try and teach people, which is on your finishing stone with extremely light pressure on the edge trailing push, and making sure that it's very small, you should not notice that it's that big of a difference, and actually it's going to be a more effective micro bevel in that way than it would if it was like a 15-degree micro bevel on a 10-degree edge. If you bear with me for a second, I know that there is a comment here on YouTube since I saw it pop up in my email, and I'd like to address it. So Paul here says, just finished sharpening my first knife. I think it went well, fixed the nicks and cuts, and it leaves a smoother, shinier surface. Yeah, that's a good thing. And your knife should leave a smoother, shinier surface on cut items when it has the right level of refinement at the edge, and it has the right kind of geometry where it's not causing cracking. And in fact, you'll notice that that's where the level of refinement in your edge comes into play. The coarser that you go, the grippier your knife is going to feel, because there's larger teeth at the edge when you're using abrasives. But it's going to cause more damage to the food. The finer you go, the quote-unquote sharper your knife will feel, and the less damage that it will cause the food as you cut. But you're not going to get that same kind of like grippy tactile feedback. Edge retention is actually pretty much the same for them. I think that coarser edges feel like they're staying sharp longer, but they're not really. Like if you look at them under a microscope, it's the same kind of damage that you'll see in one place or another. It's cutting like tomato skins and bell peppers, where having an edge with a little bit more bite than, I don't know, like one that I finished on a 20,000 grit stone will make a little bit more sense. And it's not, again, it's not that 20,000 grit or whatever edge can't cut tomato skins. It's that my 6,000 or 8,000 grit edge is going to provide me, as a chef, more tactile feel or feedback as I cut through stuff. And so my goal as someone who's cooking with cooking knives in sharpening is to make sure that I find a level of refinement that minimizes my damage to the food and also maximizes the amount of tactile feel that I get back from stuff. And one's ability to deal with those kinds of things will also depend on one's skill. You know, when you're more comfortable using knives and have a lot more experience, you're going to be much more in touch with how things feel. And you can get away with a higher grit edge than you might otherwise be able to. And when you're getting started, it might make sense to have a slightly toothier edge. I don't think it makes sense to have like a 1,000 or 2,000 grit edge for everything that you're doing, because your cuts aren't going to look as nice. You cut a carrot, like Paul was talking about on YouTube, and it's not going to look as ridiculously smooth and shiny as like a 6,000 or 8,000 grit edge. Let me look at this. Yes, Murray's three-finger test is all about exactly the same topic. And I think that in Murray's case, he knows a lot, like really, really a lot. But sometimes the way that he talks to people or his like somewhat dismissive nature at times will lead people to be like, well, that's just a BS test. Or, more often than not, people just don't understand and think they know a lot more than they know. And they'll be like, well, you know, I can do this like chromium oxide, blah, 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 and my edge shaves hair and cuts paper better. I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. I want to go and cut some food. And it's not about like watching my knife fall through stuff. It's about making sure that I have the right edge for the task at hand. And as it turns out, I tend to agree with this, and people with far more experience than me, both as cooking professionals and as kitchen knife craftsmen, will tell you that there's an appropriate amount of bite for stuff. No one wants to have a 15,000 grit edge on their knife, not because it's not sharp, but because it doesn't provide you that kind of tactile feel that you need. And yeah, I've heard a lot of the same thing, Chris, from a lot of people where they're like, his videos were one way. I think his videos are great, and I'm not bothered by anything that he says because he's right. We also happen to have a number of mutual friends in Japan who say the same thing to me all the time, and it's also the way that I think about stuff. I've heard in person he's very good at thoroughly explaining stuff to people, which I think is really just the basis of understanding sharpening, is about understanding all these basic concepts and then practice, lots and lots of practice. Anyways, that's my spiel on micro bevels. I see that there's another comment on YouTube, so let me just go and check on that really quick. And then if you guys have any other comments here, please feel free to throw them either in the question and answer session that we have up here or in the chat or something like that. And Paul says, I didn't know how long to spend on each side. How much with the 2000 and how much with the 6000 grit? Sharpening isn't necessarily a function of how much time you spend on either side of the knife. In fact, time has very little to do with it because your pressure will vary, your stroke length will vary, the kind of stone that you have relative to someone else may vary. And so if you watch earlier on in the video, we talk about edge asymmetry and geometry. When those basic concepts make sense to you, instead of paying attention to time or number of strokes or angles or whatever, what I would love nothing more than for people to do is to use their eyes and look at their blade and see, okay, this is how it looks. Okay, this is how thin it is. And then cut something. Okay, this is how it cuts. And based on the kind of information that they can gain from that, then you can say, my knife needs to be thinner behind the edge, or I need to use a micro bevel, or it's steering this way, so I have to create more surface area on that side so that it's not steering in that way. It's not a function of time, and you don't need a ratio like 70-30 or 60-40 or the 2/4, 3/4, whatever, 10 strokes, 15 strokes stuff to tell you stuff. You just need an understanding of basic concepts and a mind that you can use to think about those things and put them together in a way that makes sense. So Paul, to answer your question, instead of worrying about how much time that you need to use on each stone, or spend on each stone rather, look at your blade and see what's going on. Think about what's going on. Is it moving through food the way that you want it to? If so, great, keep doing what you're doing. If not, let's think about why. Is it because the edge is too thick? Then lower the angle or thin behind the edge. Is it because the edge is too thin and you're not getting the kind of feeling that you want? Well, you can change that if it's chipping on you. Do you notice your knife is steering in one direction? Well, you can either sharpen more on that side or change the angle on that side to create more surface area so that it steers more straight. And so, you can use those kinds of tools to figure out what's going on and make reasonable decisions about what you're doing. And so that's my answer to your question there. I have another comment on YouTube. Bear with me for a second. Sam, did you have any questions while you're here hanging out with me, by the way? I have someone here in the store, Sam, hanging out with us over here and sitting here listening to me do all this stuff. So I want to see if he had any questions as well. Do you have anything? All right, cool. No worries, man. Take your time. So another comment on YouTube says, +1 on Murray's videos being great. I really do think that, and I really appreciate his approach to thoroughly explaining things to people, and also his emphasis on edge geometry, which is extremely important, as we all know now. What do you recommend for serious thinning in a home setup? Is the Altama the best opinion over pure speed? Good coarse synthetic stone. So it's kind of an interesting concept. And Brian, I'm going to get to your question in 1 second over there. And Chris, the diamond plates are interesting. So stones like the DMT and the Altama and the plate that we have here, they have diamonds that are electrically plated onto like a nickel surface. And so what happens is that there's a hard surface and the diamonds are stuck on there. And a lot more of the diamond surface area is exposed. Therefore, the diamond stones tend to leave much deeper, coarser, aggressive scratches, and they tend to cut really quickly and they tend to stay flat. The issue is that the electronically plated nickel surfaces also tend to be relatively weak when something hard is applied to them, or when something hard, especially with heavy pressure, is applied to them, where the diamonds tend to rip out. So like you get a few sessions of sharpening out of one of those things, and it's over. And so as far as economy of use goes, they're not the most pragmatic tools. They are very fast though. There's a bunch of coarse synthetic stones that exist, including like the Gestion 220 grit stone that we have, and a bunch of other ones that are on the market. Most super coarse synthetic stones tend to dish really quickly, so you need to make sure that you're using the whole surface of the stone more effectively. But they also cut very quickly, and then the scratches aren't quite as deep because the abrasive particles are embedded within the surface, so just part of them is sticking out instead of like on the diamond plate where the whole thing is sticking out, just part of them. So the scratches aren't quite as deep, and it's easier to move up then into higher grits from there. So yeah, the diamond plates are okay. They're totally fine. It's probably one of the easier ways to do things at home. But as much as possible, you want to use a little bit lighter pressure. And keep in mind, like the Atama, the way that the surface is designed there, one, the tops are replaceable, which is kind of nice. And two, there's like chunks of diamonds. So it's not like you rip one out and then they're all gone, which would be the case for the DMT or even for our flattening plate, which is why I tell people never sharpen on it. It's designed for stone fixing. I don't know what I use a 220 stone all the time to do flattening when I'm not using my wheel. You know, Harbor Freight belt grinders, like the 1x30, are like $40 or something like that. It's the same price as the sharpening stone, and some people use that for more serious thinning. I've never gotten into using belt grinders for serious thinning, just as I just don't like them. It's not what I train on. I spend too much time training in Japan on wheels to like use the belt grinder and feel good about using that for thinning. But you know, if you do choose to use a belt grinder, make sure to use fresh belts since it helps you control heat. Make sure you pay attention to heat. You try not to overheat the edge, and just work slowly. So yeah, and then Chris says, yeah, diamond for thinning with moderate pressure. The DMT, yeah. I've used all of them. The Atama is slightly better. I still prefer things other than the diamond stones for thinning, just because I don't think it's a practical solution where you get like a handful of times out of it before all the diamonds are ripped out and your stone just doesn't cut the same way that it used to anymore. So let me get to Brian's question up here, which is that I can't seem to get the edge uniform on the left side where I have to start perpendicular to the stone to avoid the handle, and then yeah, it's just practice. But realistically, just use Sharpie as much as you can. I teach people so often, and I bring up the Sharpie method, and I feel like people treat it like training wheels on a bike, and they're just like so averse to having it on there. Like, when can I be done with Sharpie? Don't worry about being done with Sharpie. It's an extra tool that you get with a little bit extra visual feedback. One more way that you can know whether you're doing a good job or a bad job. So suck up your pride and use the Sharpie a little bit more. It will tell you everything that you need to know. If your angle is too high, too low, where you're placing pressure, where you're not. It's a lot easier to see there than it is otherwise. And just slow down and look at stuff. If you see that the angle is too high, Sharpie stained your Ginga. The acetone didn't get it off. Brian? Really? All right. I've never had the issue where acetone didn't get off, except for once, where I mixed up my super permanent Sharpie with my regular Sharpie, and then acetone no longer worked. You can use a rust eraser as long as you follow the grain of the steel. So, like for example, this happens to be a Geshin Ginga, which hopefully it will zoom in on. Please work, camera. Let's see if we can get that to go. I guess it doesn't want to zoom in on this. Let's try this instead. All right, so on here you can see that the grain pattern runs vertically in this case, so from the spine towards the edge. As long as you follow the grain pattern of the steel, it's not really the grain pattern of the steel, it's just the grind lines or like scratch pattern. As long as you follow that with something like a rust eraser, it will remove enough to get the Sharpie off of there. So grab like a fine rust eraser, or even a medium rust eraser is fine, and just work your way back and forth on that, and it'll clean up the blade and make it look all nice and pretty again. And then, when you're sharpening, make sure your hands stay clean. Otherwise, your handle's going to turn black from all the Sharpie that's coming off. So, so now you can clean it up again with some sandpaper. But in this case, Brian, rust erasers are probably the easiest way to do stuff. I don't know. I've never had that happen before until I mixed up like the super permanent Sharpie one time. So, yeah. Yes, and I also agree that the Geshin Ginga is an awesome knife. I own tons and tons of knives in my personal collection. You guys think this is my business? Realistically, it's my hobby. Like I just keep buying stuff, and I can't really help it. And so there are times where you get something and you're like, that's really good for what it is. And I think at the price point that the Geshin Ginga is, it tends to be one of the best performing knives that you can get for your dollar. And so kind of once you get beyond that, you have really more serious decisions to make. Actually, let me back up for a second, because this is something I tell people all the time in the store. The first thing I say is the more money that you spend on stuff, the more that's required of you, skill-wise and experience-wise, to be able to really use and care for and get the most out of the stuff that you're buying. And so, think about that as you buy stuff and make sure that, yeah, Mike, I totally agree with you, and make sure that what you're buying makes sense for the skill level that you have in use, in sharpening, in care, and maintenance, whatever it is. Make sure that that makes sense. And then two, I relate to cars a lot, whether it's cars or cameras or whatever. They just happen to be things that I'm pretty dorky about. And so my car spiel goes like this. No one starts off with a Ferrari as their first car. As much as you want to, it's just not going to happen. And there's good reason for it. You don't know how to drive. You don't know how to shift gears or stay in your lane or like change oil or not crash or park. So you get like a used Honda Civic or some equivalent of that, and you learn about those things and you make mistakes, and it's a lot more forgiving because you haven't spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on it, and it's a much less finicky machine. And as you start getting better and you're making more money in life, you get nicer things. And there will be a point that you get to in life where you're like at, let's say, like a Toyota Camry. And then you have to decide, do I want to go like the Lexus route or do I want to go like the Lotus route? And you'll make decisions kind of more based on that. And so you'll say like, all right, I want something that's easy to use and tough and durable and comfortable. And so you'll buy the knife that's more like that. Or I want the thinnest freaking knife behind the edge that I can find so that it moves through food the most easily. And so you'll go for that. And so let me just look at what Chris, yeah. So exactly, Chris, people will buy knives and they'll say, it doesn't work, blah, 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 and it's wrecked. And it's because, if you're forging something in W2 at 63 or 64, it's going to be a hard knife. And it's going to be more time-consuming to sharpen and more brittle. And so if they want something that's really thin and really hard, they need to be prepared for that. And as much as probably a lot of people won't like to hear it, most people aren't. Like most people just are not prepared for that. And so the Geshin Ginga is like that knife that you get right before you get into those like super finicky, nuanced things where it's the right amount of thinness and the right amount of hardness that allows it to be used by many people without being so brittle or so difficult. And it doesn't mean that like anyone can pick one up and use it. I see people chip them from time to time, but most people are okay. But it's also easy to sharpen and not overly brittle, and so I'm pretty stoked on that. But I had this conversation like right before we started this. I actually had to kick one of my friends out so I could start this video. And he wants to buy a Honyaki Gyuto. He called me the other day. He's like, one of my cooks tells me that I need a blue #1 Honyaki Gyuto. And I said, I have some Mizu Honyaki Gyutos here, but I don't think they're the right thing. And he told his cook, and his cook's like, yeah, Mizu Honyaki, those are the best. You should get that. And so he came in, and I was like, look, I know what knives you're using right now. And I know how they're sharpened because like I've helped you with all that stuff. It's probably not the right way to go. You want to find something that's going to be a little bit more tough and durable for the kinds of things that you're doing. And, in your kitchen, for example, carbon steel is not going to work as well because you guys have a lot of acidic foods, and it's like a shit show during dinner service. And so we talked about that kind of stuff, but it's not always the best. And there's no like objective best. You got to be introspective and think about what makes sense for you, for your skill levels, for your abilities in sharpening and care and maintenance. And so that's my car spiel. And same thing with cameras, same things with pretty much anything in life. So Brian, let's see what you have here. Can you talk about sharpening a single bevel knife versus a wide bevel knife like in your Kochi line? Is it basically the same as a single bevel just on both sides? The short answer is yes. Let me grab my single bevel pages that I have somewhere around here, and I will talk a little bit about that and then explain how that relates to the wide bevel knives. And there's a couple of ways that you can approach the wide bevel sharpening. And in fact, I'm going to go grab one of the Kochis, and I'm going to go grab a single bevel knife so that I can show you guys what I'm talking about when I'm doing that. So bear with me for a second, and I will be right back. Kochi. And for the sake of sanity, we will stick to a Kochi single bevel knife as well, with the kuroichi finish, because I like the kuroichi finish. All right. So, first let me go over the basic concepts of single bevel sharpening, and then let me talk about how they relate to wide bevel knives and what options you have. As long as I'm doing this, I'll start from the very beginning. Here are the three main types of single bevel knives that you see. I can't see anything. There it is. Yanagiba, top one, Deba, and Usuba down here. And this one happens to be a Kamagato Usuba. They are used for example, Yanagiba is used for fish slicing, fish that's already been filleted. Techniques like sogizukuri, which is slicing on a bias this way, hirazukuri, which is slicing this way, usuzukuri, which is the same as sogizukuri but thinner, skinning stuff, and all kinds of specific cutting techniques like that. Deba is the knife that's used for fish filleting and butchery, and not meat butchery, fish butchery. It's not the best knife for chicken or beef or short ribs or what. In fact, it sucks for those things. But for fish, it's awesome. And the techniques that you'll see there are Samaoroshi and Gomaoroshi and Daimyoroshi. And we have videos on a lot of this stuff up on the Japanese Knife Society YouTube page, so you can actually see how all that stuff goes. Or you can come into the store and see the absurd number of books that I have that go over every single freaking cutting technique that you'd ever possibly imagine, except that they're all in Japanese. So, there's that. Anyways, Usuba is used for a lot of the vegetable techniques you see, Katsuramuki, Sengiri, which includes Yokoken and Tateken, Sasagaki, which is a whittling technique, but it's not great for like the everyday dicing that you see in Western cuisine. Those are the three main kinds of single bevel knives you see. And there will be combinations of them also. So you'll see, like, for example, I want to put together a Yanagiba and a Deba. That's a Miyoroshi Deba. That's what it is. It is the combination of those two things. Or I want to put together the Yanagiba and the Usuba. Welcome to Kiritsuke. That is what I am. So, those are the functions of those knives. A lot of people misinterpret them. One, because the Miyoroshi Deba kind of looks like a chef's knife. It's not a chef's knife. It's not going to work like a chef's knife. And two, the Kiritsuke is one of those like lost in translation issues where people will say it's an all-purpose chef's knife. Well, in a Japanese kitchen, it definitely covers a lot of the tasks that you're doing, but it's not the same as a gyuto, and it's not going to work the same as a gyuto, and so you can't use it like a gyuto. It's not an all-purpose chef's knife in that way. So that's first about the shapes of knives. Second is to understand the geometry of single bevel knives. So I have my little image here, which hopefully will focus. This one shows a clad knife. It's possible to show the same thing with honyaki knives. It just wouldn't have the hard steel and soft steel. But what you'll see is that the backside tends to be a little bit hollow ground. There's flat sections here and here. There's the shinogi line, which is right here, which is where that top of the bevel is over there. In this case, you'll see where the shiny part ends and the black part begins. So above the mirror polish thing and above the misty part where the black part is, that is the shinogi line, which is here. You'll see the flat part of the blade here, which we'll call the tail of the knife. And there's a big bevel here. And on the knife, it looks flat-ish. in reality, it's a compound bevel that's slightly convexed. We call that a Hamaguri edge. And so what you'll see is from this part to about 1/2 to 2/3 down the blade, we'll have one angle. And there will be another angle where it's just the slightest difference, and I'll explain that in a second, that goes all the way down to the edge. And then usually we'll have a micro bevel here. The reason that this kind of construction works on single bevel knives is it's an issue of pressure control and inclusive angle. The inclusive angle tends to be much more acute on single bevel knives because you're sharpening just on one side at whatever it is, 8 degrees, 10 degrees, whatever, instead of doing that on both sides. So when I have a knife that's sharpened on 10 degrees on one side and flat on the other, that's a 10-degree inclusive angle. When I sharpen 10 degrees on one side and 10 degree on the other, it's a 20-degree inclusive angle. One is going to feel a lot sharper than the other. And the single bevel knives do tend to be thicker at the spine, so they'll wedge in foods a little bit more. But on soft, pliable things, you'll see that they move through with a lot greater ease, and that tends to be the bulk of what's being cut with a knife like a Yanagiba, for example. So the hollow ground side of the knife does not exert pressure against food. The bevel side does. And so the ways that we use cutting techniques on here rely on that kind of interaction with the food. So for example, when I'm filleting fish with the deba, the hollow ground side is facing up towards the meat, and the bevel side is facing down towards the bone. So all of my pressure is being exerted against the bones of the fish, and very little of it's being exerted against the meat, which allows me to cause a little bit less damage to it as I cut through stuff. The same thing goes for like sohizukuri, slicing this way, for example. The hollow ground side is facing up towards the piece that I'm slicing away from, so I can slice things like fluke or whatever delicate fish and have less damage caused. Whereas when I slice hardier fish, like sometimes red snapper or tuna or something like that, I can use what's called hirazukuri, where I slice this way and release to the side, and I'm using the bevel side of the knife to control where pressure is being placed and how I want my food to move. Sorry, 1 second. Chris recently bought a 72 diameter platen just for that hollow ground. I'm going to explain something to you about the hollow ground thing really quick, just so you have a really, really clear idea. It is not just as simple as putting the knife against something in that diameter and sharpening it. And in fact, most craftsmen will have very specific ways that they design it, where they'll do like a little bit in, and then like a flatter part, and then like a little bit out, or some will do it more set aside that way. And so the diameter of the wheel actually has very little to do with the diameter of the uraski. It makes it easier to have a wider wheel, but there's a lot more thought that goes into it than just pressing that thing against there, one. And number two, you'll notice that, or at least I've noticed from a lot of American makers that have done single bevel knives, with the exception, of course, of Murray and a couple others I know of that actually have spent time training in Japan, most people tend to over-grind the backside. It's like a super deep uraski, super deep hollow ground part. It doesn't make sense at all. So it's not just as simple as like press it up against the big diameter thing and then you're done. There's a lot more thought that goes into it than just that as a function of the way that things are designed. So it's something to keep in mind as you get started on that kind of stuff. So what I was saying about these things is, so we have the different bevel angles, and then at this point we actually round them together using like a slight wrist action or really soft and muddy stone so that it looks nice and smooth. It's not a necessary step realistically. It doesn't really matter that much, but I've found that most of my customers want stuff that looks pretty, and so it's nice to make stuff look pretty, and that's part of what's going on there. But it also does affect the way it interacts with food a little bit. As instead of having like flat bevels that food comes up and presses against, it has a little bit more convex edge and tends to come up and push away a little bit more easily. So it tends to release food a little bit better when you actually do the hamaguri edge. The angle changes are not significant angle changes. When I'm sharpening, I'm not actually like rotating my wrist to change the angle from one to the other. The first sharpening that I do is going to be like this, from the shinogi line down to like that lamination line, or wherever it needs to be, that halfway or 2/3 way up the blade. My first sharpening is going to have my fingers placed on the back of the knife directly above where the shinogi line would be. So you can see the shinogi line here, and my fingers are on the back exactly where that would be. And my pressure is going to be down against the stone and back up against the shinogi line as if I'm trying to push it up. And that's my goal. I want to move the shinogi line up evenly across the blade, the exact same amount that I'm likely to in my next step, where I move my fingers down towards the edge and have my pressure placing down against the stone towards the edge, where I'm forming a burr in this case, I want to make sure that the shinogi line moves up the same amount of how much I'm reducing the edge. So if I move the edge up 1 millimeter, shinogi line needs to move up 1 millimeter. That helps me maintain my edge geometry. So in the first part of our sharpening, where we sharpen from the shinogi line down, my goal is to watch the shinogi line and make sure that it's moving up evenly and consistently. In the second part of my sharpening, where I sharpen the edge of the knife, my goal is to look at the edge, make sure it's being sharpened even and consistently, but also feel for a burr and make sure that the burr is even and consistent. And a quick note on feeling for burrs. A lot of people tend to do it with their thumbs. I recommend not doing it with your thumb. I recommend using your index finger and your middle finger and coming up across the blade this way, as they're a lot more sensitive, and you're more likely to be able to feel smaller burrs that way. So please do that. So what we'll do is sharpen, first sharpening from here down to like here, and then here down to here for our second sharpening. And then on our finishing stone, we'll lie the knife flat on the stone and do uraoshi sharpening, where our pressure is on the push and relax on the pull. And I have a whole video that goes into the intricacies of that. But that's always done on the finishing stone, with the exception of maybe the first time that you're sharpening the knife to get the urasuki, the flat part around the edge, or uraoshi rather. The flat part around the edge is called the same as the kind of sharpening that you do. Urasuki is the hollow ground part. Anyways, to get the uraoshi set up in the appropriate way, you may want to do it with a coarse or medium grit stone first, but for most people, in most cases, I would not recommend that. So the backside will be done always on a finishing stone. So you'll do, for example, on the front of your knife, coarse stone, top bevel, bottom bevel, then finishing stone backside, then medium stone, top bevel, bottom bevel, then finishing stone backside, then finishing stone, top, bottom, backside. Then you can blend everything together. If you want to put on a micro bevel at that point, that's the time you can do that. Backside, remove a burr, clean everything up. When you want things to look nice and pretty, you want to use softer, muddier stones. They tend to fill in high and low spots and be a little bit more forgiving with that kind of stuff, but they're also going to leave a more smooth and even finish. It's just an aesthetic thing and a personal preference on my part. And on the backside, you want to have slightly harder stones so that it stays flat, and you can do the backside in a more even and consistent way. So that's the basics of sharpening single bevel knives. And you'll note that over time, as they shrink, you'll see the black line was the original outline. The red line is where it goes as it moves up, and you'll see that the edge and the shinogi line move up at the same rate. You also notice that on this image here, wherever it is, that the backside, the urasuki, shrinks more slowly than the bevel side, and that's because you're only sharpening the backside on a finishing stone. You have limited real estate here with the hollow ground part. And so if you over-sharpen it, it tends to flatten out, and then your knife doesn't interact with food the same way that you want it to anymore, and kind of makes the knife not as functional as it used to be. So that's the basic of single bevel sharpening. You'll see that there are a lot of wide bevel knives like the Kochi here that have a bevel that looks kind of similar to the Yanagiba, except that instead of being this way on one side, it's this way on the other side. It's the same. There are a couple of ways that you can go about sharpening wide bevel knives, and it just really depends on what you want to do. The best looking, and I think most fun to use style of sharpening is also more difficult and requires a lot more of you as an end user, skill-wise and experience-wise, to be able to, one, do the sharpening, and two, use an edge that's going to be as thin as what I'm about to explain to you, which is that you do exactly what I just explained on the single bevel knife on both sides, and then if you want to use a micro bevel, great, use a micro bevel on one side, kind of like I explained in the micro bevel video. This will help you always maintain the geometry of your knife over time, because you're going to be constantly thinning your knife as you go up. So your knife will maintain the kind of thinness that you want behind the edge, tends to have really good food release, but it's going to tend to be on the more brittle side because of how thin it's going to be. So that's one thing that you can do. And again, you can mitigate how brittle or not brittle it's going to be by use of adjusting sharpening angles, and more importantly, that micro bevel, which is going to be a great tool in knives like this. The second thing that you can do, and some people choose to do, is just sharpen it like a regular knife. You pick the angle that you want to sharpen it, 10, 15, whatever degree you choose. 13.625 doesn't matter, and you'll sharpen that way regularly. And then over time, whenever you feel the need to, you'll sharpen the wide bevel part of it, thinning behind the edge. And so what you'll see is something like this. Let me just grab my little drawing board really quick. and show you what it looks like. Give me a second. Again, you have to excuse my really horrible artistry. So this will be your knife kind of to begin with, right? And you can kind of see here at the edge. So if you choose to sharpen it like a regular knife, just keep in mind that I'm going to point to the shinogi line here with some arrows. So you can see where the shinogi line would be, right there. Sorry again for my really crappy drawing. So over time as you sharpen, you're going to do something like this to the edge, right? And eventually, when it gets to a point where you notice that it's bothering you, you can see that I've moved the edge up that much. That means that I need to move the shinogi line up that much. So what I do is something like this. Sorry, bear with me again while I really try to make my drawing not as crappy as it probably looks like to you guys. Where now you can see where my shinogi line was originally, and this is where it is now. So those are the ways that you have as options of dealing with the wide bevel knives, and it's going to depend on your skill levels, your abilities, and what you like, what works best for you. It is my personal preference that I do the more like single bevel knife sharpening, but on both sides, and then I tend to use a micro bevel because it tends to stay thinner, it tends to have a little bit better food release, and it looks prettier. And quite frankly, not only is that important to me, but like most of my customers want stuff that looks pretty, you know. So when they come and pay me for sharpening, they expect the knife to come back looking nice, not looking like it was sharpened. So I need to make sure that that's one of these. I tend to prefer that way. But as a realistic kind of pragmatic view on what people may or may not actually do, as long as what you're doing makes sense and you can think about it in a reasonable way and logically and coherently explain what you're doing, like go for it. So if you choose to sharpen it like a regular knife and thin over time every once in a while, great. If you want to sharpen it like I just explained, great. So Brian, does that answer your question? In my very long-winded, ridiculous answer? Cool, perfect. Let me go see if there are any other comments really quick on YouTube or anywhere else. But while I have you guys on here, does anyone else have any questions in the meantime that I can answer for you guys? Anything? Nothing? Sam, you got anything left?
Yeah, the difference of like ease of sharpening between like different kinds of steel.
All right, Sam asked about the difference in ease of sharpening between different kinds of steels, and it's a relatively complicated issue, and here's why. There are a few things that are going to affect it. One is the way the knife is heat treated, and I mean like hardness, but also what specific temperatures they take it to, and what they quench it, and how long it stays at those temperatures, because it's going to affect how the various elements of the steel interact with one another. And then two, what those various elements of the steel are, and all of that aside from actual edge geometry. So like, for example, wider bevels take a lot more time to sharpen because there's a lot more surface area that you're dealing with in terms of what's in contact with the stone. But the gist of it is this. The harder the steel is, the more likely it's going to be a little bit more difficult to sharpen. And also, the greater volume of alloying elements or carbides that there are, hard carbides that there are on the steel, the harder it is likely to be able to be sharpened. And so when you think about what affects those things, the first thing that affects hardness almost more than anything else is carbon content. The higher the carbon content, the greater the potential hardness of the steel. The greater the potential hardness of the steel, the more likely that someone is to harden it that way, which then is going to make it a little bit more difficult to sharpen. Then, of course, the alloying elements. Vanadium, for example, is a pain in the butt to sharpen. Tungsten is a pain in the butt to sharpen. So the more of that the higher volume of those kind of carbides and alloying elements there are, the more time consuming it's going to be to sharpen. And so, depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking for something that's going to be like a very easy to sharpen steel, you're going to want something that's not super hard and has a very fine grain structure without having a lot of alloying elements. And so like white number 2 happens to be an example of that. If you want something that's going to be much harder to sharpen, you can look at some stainless steels that have particularly high volumes of chromium, tungsten, vanadium, whatever, all these kinds of alloying elements, and you notice that those are going to be a lot more time consuming to sharpen. There's one last kind of issue of it that's kind of tricky, which is sometimes really soft steels, especially stainless steels where there's some chromium there, they tend to get this like gummy feeling on the stones, and it's not that they're like difficult to sharpen, they just don't feel good to sharpen. And so, that might be an issue, but more often than not, with the kinds of things that you're seeing in Japanese knives, it's not really an issue. But like in the Henkel and Wusthof, stuff like that, you notice that even though the steels are not particularly hard, they tend to have this like abrasion-resistant gumminess, and it's not that they're more difficult to sharpen, it's that they're like
So like between
one second. Can you guys hear me again? Where did it get lost? I guess my Bluetooth decided to crap out on me there. Yeah, gummy. Yeah, so it's that they're heat treated in such a way that that makes them more tough and durable, and therefore they're a little bit more time consuming. You also want to pay attention to the kind of stone that you're using. The abrasive type and the binding agents will both make a difference in how your stone cuts, and not always in the way that people think. So for example, here's some basic things that make sense. Silicon carbide tends to not be quite as aggressive as aluminum oxide as a function of the abrasive type. So you'll see that aluminum oxide or variants of aluminum oxide tend to be faster cutting than silicon carbide. Softer stones tend to cut faster than harder stones as a function of the fact that they release more abrasive more quickly, and so there's more fresh abrasive cutting more quickly, but they dish more quickly. Certain stones like ceramic, for example, tend to have a binding agent that also has cutting action, and so they tend to cut more quickly. Abrasive density doesn't always play out the same way that people think. Sometimes abrasive density can work out well, so like Sigma Power makes a stone that has very little binding agent in it, and is constantly releasing fresh abrasive because it's only fresh abrasive. But a lot of times people will go to like stone manufacturers. I made this mistake actually early on when we were having stones custom made for us. I'll say like, I want super high abrasive density, like just pack that stuff in there. And what happens is that the stone actually starts to cut slower because those abrasives are really hard, and there's not as much binding agent, so it doesn't wear in the same way, and you get worn down abrasives that don't cut quite as quickly. So there's a balance. Obviously, too little of an abrasive and it's not going to cut too quickly, but as it turns out, too much abrasive packed into the stone, it's also not going to cut quite as quickly. And there's a range of things that's going to make sense. So I tend to prefer personally, for example, I like white alumina or variants of white alumina as a base for the stones, and then the ceramic stones we have, like the Geshin 400, 2000, 4000, they tend to cut quick because the binding agent is also acting as an abrasive, and the abrasive type, the specific abrasive type that we use in there is an extremely aggressive variant of alumina. The vitrified stones that we have tend to release a lot of abrasive relatively quickly and have a high percentage of abrasive without being like overdone. So that's like our Geshin 8000 and the 1000, 6000 combo stone. And in fact, I'm about to add 2 new stones to our lineup, including the 3000 and 6000 grit stone. And then we have resinoid-based stones where they get much nicer polish, and it seems to be that the binding agent there acts not like a burnishing agent, but not in the same way that ceramic acts, and so the binding agent tends to contribute to the polish of the blade in resinoid-based stones, more like the Geshin 6000, 5000, 1200, 600. They tend to get like nicer polish that's more even and consistent just as a function of the binding agent. So does that long-winded answer work for your question?
Yes. So, I was gonna ask you the question.
Yeah,
So
speak up, because
between,
now it's actually on the speakerphone thing.
yeah, between like the Zachary and the Dixon Pedigree.
Mm-hmm. They're both blue number 1 steels?
Yeah. So the
Yeah. In the case of these two, because of the differences in region, the way that they work. So the question was, the Zachary blue number 1 and the Geshin Kageki, they're both blue number 1 steels. How are they going to be different? Why do they feel different, essentially, right? And the gist of it is this. The regions are different they're made from, so the way that they forge and heat treat the knives are going to be different. But the Zachary knives, it's important to understand what that region's history in knife making is from. So for example, they started with forestry tools. They make like a lot of axes and stuff like that. But they always tend to choose steels that have wear resistance and corrosion resistance, because they're thinking like someone's going to take this out on like a fishing boat or into the woods or something like that. That's the mentality that they have as they go through stuff. And so the heat treatment they do is going to gear more towards toughness. So they're going for obviously like fine grain structure and toughness, and that's what they achieved in there. So it actually tends to be a little bit softer. And then in the Geshin Kagekyo line, we were going for like the ultimate extreme, like edge retention and sharpness. And so there, our whole focus is on grain size refinement and edge retention at the cost of toughness. As you see, like I always refuse to sell the knives to people when I'm really worried about stuff, and we want to make sure that it's the right fit, because they're going to be really brittle knives, and I need to make sure that people are capable of handling those kinds of things. So in the case of these ones, the Geshin Kagekyo is going to be more difficult to sharpen as a function of the higher hardness of the steel versus the Zachary, which is going to be slightly less hard. And the same thing for the Blue Super in the Zachary, by the way, is geared towards like the tougher side of Blue Super. Not quite as soft as like what you see in the Hiramoto AS, but within a realm of things with Blue Super that works well for my personal preferences, not particularly liking Blue Super, where it's not super brittle. The Blue Super is an extremely high carbon, high chromium, high tungsten, or relatively high chromium tungsten carbon steel. And so because of that, there's a lot of larger carbides that are extremely hard, and so it tends to be a little bit more difficult to sharpen. And it tends to not have the same kind of structural stability that you'll see in simpler carbon steels, but it tends to have great edge retention and a little better corrosion resistance. And my personal preference has always kind of been in the ease of sharpening, edge-taking side of things. And especially, I think, coming from professional kitchens, I've been averse to things that are overly brittle. And I've noticed that that's a little tricky, because when I first started cooking, things that were overly brittle for me then are no longer overly brittle for me now that I've developed better knife skills and better ability to sharpen and care for stuff, and a better understanding of how stuff works. So does that answer everything that you're looking for? I have another question here from Chris. I'm sure most of us know Murray recommends only 2 stones. If you were to sell a beginner package of stones to a customer, what would they include? Like Murray's onto something. I recommend probably more often than not, like the King 1000 and or 6000 stone, whether it's a combo stone or individually, to people getting started. And I know they're not the best stones out there. Like, they're not the fastest cutting. They dish relatively quickly. The abrasive is silicon carbide. They're not super aggressive on what's it called? Powdered steels or really abrasion-resistant steels. But I don't care, because my whole purpose of getting people a beginner set of stones is to get them to focus on technique and skill and consistency. And because they're not the fastest cutting stones, it means that they're going to have to practice more, and they're going to have to spend more time doing stuff. And it also means that their mistakes are going to show up not quite as quick as they would otherwise. And so it gives people a chance to slowly recognize when problems are occurring and fix them in a reasonable way. And quite frankly, like, you can get a great edge with them. It's not horribly difficult. You can get a great edge with anything. I can like go outside and sharpen on my sidewalk, or like, use newspaper or an old oil stone. It won't matter, as long as I approach my sharpening with a logical, coherent, and consistent methodology, and have consistency in angle, and form a burr and remove the burr consistently, and maintain a good edge geometry. I'm going to get a good edge. So more often than not, I recommend that. There's a lot of other stones I have. I'm always reluctant to tell someone that's just getting started sharpening yeah, you got to spend like hundreds of dollars on stuff. You don't need to spend hundreds of dollars on stuff. You need to spend time learning how to sharpen. Then once you have a better idea about sharpening and the kinds of things that you like or dislike in the stones, then I like to talk to people about that kind of stuff, and then we figure out, where they want to go from there. Whether they just want to stick with the king stones, and that's that, or if we want to get them some much fancier stuff. And I have stones that cut faster and dish less and leave specific kinds of finishes, or have specific kinds of tactile feedback, or whatever it is. Like our Geshin 1000, 6000 combo stone. It's a great stone. Do I think that everyone needs to go out and spend $135 on their first sharpening setup? No. I think it's pretty ridiculous. Some people have the financial means to do that. Great. Some people don't. It's not a big deal. More important than anything else is the skill and technique and consistency. And so that's my long-winded answer to that. And I see that, yes, you like your king stones, but you're curious about what I would recommend outside of that. I don't know. Give me a call, and we can talk about what you like and dislike about your stones, and then figure out what actually makes sense for you and what kinds of things you're sharpening, and go from there. Again, just to go back to the car analogy for a second, you've hit a point where you got that like Camry already, and now you got to choose, do you want like a Lexus or a Lotus or Ferrari, like where do you want to be? And so a lot of it is learning to be introspective and really paying attention to what you like or dislike, what's going on with the stone in front of you, and so on and so forth, and then using all that knowledge that you can gather about yourself and your personal preferences to make smarter decisions as you move forward. And that's my long-winded answer to your stone selection question. Does that make sense? I hope so. Sweet. He says, yep. So Michael Lee says here, Chris, I got your question. We read wide bevel gyutos versus regular gyutos on my phone, but not here. Oh, I totally didn't see something like that. Chris, did you have a question on wide bevel things versus double bevel something that he was saying there? And I'm looking here to see if I missed any other comments on YouTube. So I'm getting like a bunch of emails on my phone and stuff like that. So I'm not sure what's going on where. And sorry, bear with me. I see a question here from Dino. How about stropping and using loaded compounds? Could I achieve the same results with stones by using a super high grit stone? That's kind of a tricky one. It really depends on the stropping. One, you'll see that like I'm not a big advocate of using loaded strops for kitchen knives. And it's not because they don't improve the edges. They if you look at stuff under a microscope, it actually improves the edge. It's again going back to that finding the appropriate edge for the task at hand issue, and making sure that you're getting the kind of tactile feedback that you need relative to the kind of smooth cutting action that you want, where it causes little damage to food and so on and so forth. You could totally strop. Like I know a lot of people that use the 1 micron diamond sprays and all that kind of stuff, and it's fine. There are some high grit stones that you can achieve similar results to, but nothing's going to be like that 0.5 micron whatever chromium oxide or even finer stuff in stones. It's just not really the way that stones are being designed. Natural stones are one option that you have where the abrasives are friable, meaning that they break down into smaller and smaller sizes. And if you want to get that kind of fine grit, you're going to want to find a natural stone that's on the slightly harder side, such that it releases abrasive a little bit more slowly. And what you'll do is you'll either use an agura or use your knife, work up mud so you have a lot of fresh abrasive released, and then release your pressure and start to work down the mud until it gets finer and finer, achieving those kinds of results. But nothing is quite the same as stropping with those super high grit compounds. And for what it's worth, my personal recommendation is I don't think that those super high grit compounds are a worthwhile venture on kitchen knives. I think that they're awesome for straight razors. I don't think that you're going to get a better shave without them. I think that the shave is much better with them. I think that for some outdoor knives that people have where they're going crazy about having these super ridiculous edges, cool, it's a hobby at that point. Have fun, knock yourself out, use 0.000125 micron, whatever, and it's whatever. But for kitchen knives, as I explained earlier, there's a balance that you're looking for in one, causing as little damage to the food as possible, but two, providing you a grippy, tactile feel to your cut. And it turns out that my experience leads me to believe that that range is somewhere between, like, I don't know, 3,000 and 8,000. And you can go a little bit beyond that and a little bit below. You know, no one's going to flip their stuff. And you can use high grit compounds. I'm telling you that the edge that you're going to get is not going to provide the same kind of tactile feedback to you as an end user as it will when you're in that range that I've just explained. It doesn't have anything to do with edge retention or anything like that, just as a function of feel. And so I'm looking here. Is there a fundamental difference in performance between a wide bevel and regular bevel guto? Let me approach that one first, and then talk about your stropping on balsa, blah, blah, blah stuff. There is no fundamental difference necessarily between them, but there tends to be some fundamental differences in this case between the wide bevel and regular gutos. First is that wide bevel gutos tend to not be as thin at the spine because you tend to need a little bit more spine thickness to create those wide bevels. It's not always the case. There's some perfect examples of things that are not that way, but they tend to be that way, which tends to lead them to have a little bit better food release as there's a little bit more space for the bevel to have that kind of convexing and so on and so forth. Second, the wide bevels, the way that they interact with food and food release, does tend to give better food release, as like when you hit the top of the bevel, the food tends to come off this way instead of riding all the way up on a bevel that's like convex nicely all the way through from edge to spine. However, because of that, it's easier to have a knife that is thinner, not just behind the edge, but like towards the middle section of the blade and so on and so forth. In a regular style guto, I guess, not a wide bevel guto. And it's also more likely that you're going to get a knife that's like thinner directly behind the edge in a wide bevel guto, just as a function of the way that those knives are being ground. Fundamental differences, sure, I guess there are some. Really things that significantly impact the end user experience in a way where you'd be like, I only like these or I only like those. No, like different strokes for different folks. Try different things, see how they work, develop your own opinions on stuff as you go. But I have a lot of all of them, and I like them all. And it just depends on what I feel like sometimes, quite frankly. I mean, I got like, I don't even know how many gutos I have now. You know, the choice comes down to like, today I feel like this knife, or today I feel like this knife, and you know, it will be fine. It's not the end of the world. So that's my answer to that. And then I see here you say you use high micron balsa strops to polish, and then drop down back to a couple of blah blah passes on a lower grit to put some tooth in it. Cool. So what's the purpose of polishing? Removing fatigue steel at the edge, or kind of helping it not be so stressed, or you know, what's the deal there? If you're dropping back down, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference that much anyway, since the final grit is going to be the final grit. There's definitely something to be said for stressing steel during sharpening. High pressure sharpening, or you know, removing lots of steel will actually stress the steel, and it tends to relax over time. And some of that can be dealt with in stropping. But if you're dropping back down, it's not really much of an issue. I would, just as a function of saving yourself a little bit of time, assuming that you're capable of sharpening in a really good way and getting nice clean edges from a stone, just find the stone that's got the appropriate edge feel for you and finish on that stone. And then that's that. But if it's about stressing the steel and that kind of stuff, yeah, like stropping can affect that kind of thing. You know, again, stropping isn't a bad tool, but there are just as many things that can be difficult about it, including rounding over edges depending on the kind of strop that you're using and your angle consistency. I've also found that through teaching sharpening classes a bunch, when I get to the stropping and burr removal part, because I do have people strop, I just have them do it on stones as a function of burr removal. People tend to not be consistent with the angle that they strop at relative to the angle that they sharpen at. And I make people like strop and then color in the knife, and then strop and then color in the knife, just to make sure that I can get them to be consistent with their angle. So when you're consistent with your angle, doesn't really matter as much. When you're not, strops can be a little bit more forgiving, just due to the play in the surface a little bit. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer to that as well. Anyone else have any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to get home and go and hang out with my wife and kid. So yeah, if you guys have any more questions, I'm going to look one more time on YouTube and see what's going on, and watch the chat here for another couple of seconds. And if not, then we'll call it a night, and that will be that. Let me see what's going on over here. Sorry for the kind of dead time over here. Looks like I got all those comments covered. And let's check chat over here. Looks good. So, Sam, were there any other things that you had over here? Cool. We're calling it a day. Thank you guys very much. I hope that this was an informative broadcast. Sorry for any offensive comments that might have been made through the earlier parts of this. And I hope that you guys learned a lot, and maybe we'll be able to do this again at some point soon. But specifically on the issues of edge asymmetry and microbevels, I hope that the earlier parts of this video answer a lot of those questions for you guys. So thank you very much, and have a great night.